for short, Motif, no fun. So first off, how many of you have heard of the term melody before? Alright, how many of you have heard of the term motif before? Alright, so maybe about half. Alright. So I'm going to be talking about motif development used in 3 different games that I wrote music for. Dreams and Nightmares, Fat Roll, and Breaker's World. So first off, let's talk about what makes a melody strong. Alright, we have to have 3 main elements, or at least these 3 are minimum requirements. Right? We need to have repetition, we need to have variation, and we need to have new material. So if you have some sort of melodic concept, or you have some sort of motif that you're trying to reiterate over and over again so that the listener is able to recognize that as it comes back in different forms, you definitely want to make sure that you have some sort of repetition of that. But you don't want to just repeat the same thing over and over and over again, because that's going to get obviously quite a bit boring. So you need to incorporate a little bit of variation. Now, if you just repeat and make variations of that repetition, it also can start to sound a little bit too on the nose. So of course you want to incorporate a little bit of new material so that you can keep your listener guessing as to what will come next. So we have the core elements that need to be recognizable by the listener. And so this sometimes we will call a hook in songwriting. Sometimes we will call it a kernel, a very small portion of a melodic concept. Or today we will use the term motif, which is normally used in the late classical and early romantic era. So the listener is going to be able to recognize the contour, meaning the overall shape of that motif, and they're going to recognize any rhythmically identifiable characteristics. So something in terms of short to long, long to short, that's something that they will recognize, even if it's expanded to be something that is long and long, but you recognize the first long note was longer. You'll still hear it as a long-short relationship between those 2 notes. And so let's start off with what a motif is. Go classically to the dictionary. So we have Oxford Languages here. In art or literary composition, a distinctive feature or dominant idea. In music, it's a short succession of notes producing a single impression, a brief melodic or rhythmic formula out of which longer passages are developed. If we look at Merriam-Webster, it says, in the arts, a usually recurring salient thematic element, salient meaning important or brought to the top. And then in dictionary.com, we have a recurring subject, theme, idea, etc., especially in literary, artistic, or musical work, a dominant idea or feature. So you can think about a motif of an argument or a situation as being synonymous with the word we use at crux. The crux of an argument is the most important feature, or the crux of the situation is something that delves out into all elements of that situation. This comes from, of course, the term cross, which is the motif of the biblical narrative. So, possibilities for melodic movement. With our motif, we want to make sure that we have some sort of logical movement from note to note. So we have 3 different choices. Stepwise up or down. I guess you can call that 2 choices in itself, but we'll call it 1 for now. Stepwise motion. And then we have leaps up or down, which is something that is greater than a step. Some people use the term skip as a small leap separate from leaps, but today, for our purposes, we're going to call anything bigger than a step a leap. We can classify those leaps as being bigger or smaller, but mainly the listener is going to hear that shape. They're not going to identify the specific distance of that leap. And then we have repeated notes. So if you play a note at the same time, over and over again, you'll recognize that it's not going up or down, and even the least trained musical person will be able to recognize, oh, that note is staying the same. And so here are the 3 possibilities that we have with melodic movement. Now, these melodies that we are constructing are created from building putting these motifs together. So first we start with the motif. You can think about that as the basic building block. And then we construct our melody out of either that motif or a combination of motifs. A melody can have more than one motif. If we think about Leia's theme for Star Wars, it has its first motif, followed by its second motif, which we would call the tail motif. And you can hear that later in that theme, we chain those tail motifs together multiple times so that we don't have to hear that motif in its full form over and over again, but rather we split it into two separate motifs from which we can construct a folk melody. So first we're going to talk about Dreams and Nightmares. Dreams and Nightmares is a Christian game developers community game Christian game developers conference community game that was made in 2020 and 2021 season. And I had the pleasure of writing music for the first act of it. It was initially intended to be a 4-act game, but we ended up going with 2 acts for that first 2020-2021 season. I believe we will be reinitiating that and starting the next 2 acts for this next coming season. But today we are just going to talk about music from Act 1. So when I approached this composition, I tried to decide, well, what are the parameters that we're going to use to take into consideration when we are composing? Because we want to make sure that anytime that we're writing music for the game, the choices that we make in terms of how it evolves are directly inferred by the game itself. We want to make sure that there's a relationship that is tightly knit between the game and what's going on musically, so that they don't seem like 2 separate things. So one of the parameters that I wanted to take into consideration was the time of day. So as you get further through Act 1, the lighting is going to change to become darker. And so I wanted to make sure that that was something that was addressed and recognized by the listener. Also, I wanted to give the player a hint as to when they were to the center of the forest. So if they're getting closer to the center of the forest, they will recognize some musical differences based on whether far away from the center of the forest. As we first started off the project, we tried to use procedural generation to create the maze that you are going through this Act 1. And eventually we decided to opt for more of a straight shot linear progression. Luckily, the center of the forest remained the center of the forest, so this did not throw off any of the composition that I had already created. And then I wanted to incorporate the idea of combat, whether or not you are in combat or out of combat. I didn't want to be 2 separate pieces of music, but rather I was trying to keep them as one overarching piece of music within which the accompaniment would be able to change to represent when you are in combat or out of combat. So going back to these 3 points, time of day, we are using harmonic development in order to give the listener an idea as to how they are progressing through the level. So in the simplest of terms, we are going from a more happy feeling to a more dissonant and disgruntled feeling as we go toward the end of the act. In terms of the proximity to the center of the forest, I used the idea of compressing the motif as well as a little bit of harmonic development to give the player an idea of when they're getting closer or further away from the center of the forest. So the idea of compression means taking that motif and making it shorter, right? Whereas it would be the opposite of expanding. And then finally, we have the combat stage, which I wanted to represent by the texture used in the accompaniment. So we have our melody, which is the main part that you go home singing. If someone says, hey, how did that song go? You say, you sing them the melody, and they recognize it. Generally, you wouldn't sing the accompaniment. That would be something that would be underneath the main layer. And so this is something that is able to be changed while keeping the cohesion of the piece overall. So some of the features of development that I used in this, one of them is a round. So how many of you have heard of a round before in music? All right, so for those of you who have not, let's try something here. Does everyone know the row, row, row your boat song? All right, over here, I want you to start row, row, row your boat, and when I point at you guys, I want you to start row, row, row your boat. Ready, go! Row, row, row your boat. offset from another initiation of that melody. And so this was something that I wanted to incorporate with little parameters of randomness. I wanted to make sure that the music would be able to not sound bold, no matter how long you stay in a certain area. And so as you go through, the iterations of this melody pop in fairly randomly, based on how we coded in the middleware as well. Another feature of development we use is truncation. So if you take a tree and you chop it so that it's only left with the trunk, you have made it shorter, which is exactly what truncation is, making a motif shorter. Not compressing it, but rather taking out parts of it. Next we have interpolation, which is the opposite of that. Interpolation is adding on to that motivic idea, making it longer. The main way which I tried to do this was by chaining motifs. So taking one motif, having the end of that motif be the start of a new motif. This is a decent way to interpolate while also keeping cohesion with the melody. Then we have intervallic inversion, which is basically, you can think about it as vertically flipping. So if we have one short note going up to one long note, this would be instead one short note going down to one long note. So we are going the opposite direction in terms of pitch, higher or lower. Another type of inversion is rhythmic inversion. So instead of having short long, you have long short. And as long as the interval remains the same, the listener will be able to pick up on cohesion between those two instances. And finally, we have motivic compression, which we've already talked about a little bit, which is taking the motif and pushing it together to make it smaller. So as you enter the very beginning of Act 1, right away you get a little bit of a hint toward what the motif is. And this motif is meant to represent pride. Each of the acts in Dreams and Nightmares is meant to be aligned with one of the specific main 4 characters, each of which has a primary vice that they're trying to overcome in their act. And for Act 1, that was pride. With the character Evie having a little bit too much, she was a little bit too full of herself, we'll say. I could understand. I was a student who really was obsessed with A+ back when I was a youngster. And so when you get a bunch of A+, pride is right around the corner. Now, we start off with this very high note, right? But, as we all know, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before the fall. All right, so here's representing the fall. We have one high note that is a little bit pompous and a slight decline, and the great fall leading down to a lower long note. Then the attempts to come back up, but it does not bear fruit too well, and we start to decline a little bit. So, to describe this, we have a high long note, followed by a step down to a short note, a lead down to a long note, a step up to a short note, a small lead, or we can call it a skip, up to a longer note, followed by a step down to a long note, step down to a long note. This is a 7-note motif that I use throughout all of Act 1, and it is pervasive all the way through. It is nearly relentless in how often it occurs, but while I want that to be very repetitious, I don't want it to hit the listener over the head to the point where they get annoyed by it or start feeling like it's sounding old. So, one other way you could interpret this, if you wanted to, is looking at the first 2 notes and then seeing that the next 2 notes are actually an intervallic inversion of those first 2 notes. Now, some people might look at this and say, oh, well, that's only a 2-note motif, and it's being flipped for the rest of this. However, I think that this occurs in its 7-note form so often that it needs to be interpreted all in context together as one standard motif. Here's our first example. This is when you enter the forest. We have the motif at full length, which is 8 measures. A measure is separated by those vertical lines, we call them bar lines. So if you look at the very first system, the very first line of music, that is 8 measures, and that has our full motif, the high high long note, step down to a short note, leap down to a long note, step up to a short note, skip up to a long note, step down, step down. The same 7-note pattern we just talked about. Now, when we first come into the forest, I wanted to use what's called G mixolydian mode. So if you have you guys all heard of the term major scale before?
Yes.
Yeah, go back to the elementary basic knowledge. That is the theory that we learned back in the early ages. Right? So we have a normal major scale, which is do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. However, mixolydian mode is the same thing as that, but with a lower 7th note. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And so instead of having that leading tone really pushing for that final note, it's actually giving us a lowered inflection, which is generally how I used it. I did not generally use that with its movement back upward to our main note, our G, because it has a lowered inflection. It's trying to move downward, just as the prime motif. So here, we will be able to hear how this mixolydian mode works within the beginning of the forest. It's a very common mode that's used in explorative music. You'll hear it a lot in the early Pokemon games especially. So here's an example of that. And now here in the orange, you can see the interpolation of the tail of the motif. Now here we have harmony that comes in, still fulfilling this 7-note motif. Now here we have the extents of a round coming in with a soon in harmony, followed by a round of the flute. And again, these are all called with relative randomness in our middleware. Next, as you get a little bit further through the forest, we still hear the motif at full length, 8 measures. However, I wanted to give the player just a small, very subtle hint that they are moving closer to the center of the forest and progressing through their level. So, what we wanted to do is incorporate just a tinge of harmonic development. So, in this first section of the forest, we just have a chord progression, G major to F major, over and over and over. Here, we are expecting to hear the same exact thing when we start off with G to F and back to G. However, that fourth chord is the one that's going to be a little bit different, trying to give a little bit of a flair to how the harmony is being developed. You can take a listen here. Next, as you get a little bit further toward the center of the forest, we start to hear a compression of the motif. So it is no longer 8 measures in length, but now it's only 6 measures. We've also started to develop the harmony a little bit more, incorporating an E-flat major chord, as well as continuing to keep that A-flat major 7 chord that we had from the previous section. This we could consider G mixolydian mode with an altered 6th scale degree. That's the little circles that we saw from the previous section. And then also now we're adding in 2 other altered scale degrees. 2nd scale degree, which is our 2nd note of the scale, and our 3rd scale degree, the 3rd note of the scale. So in doing this, I'm adding a little bit more harmonic complexity as we go further in the forest, giving the player a subtle push toward recognizing, oh, we're getting further in there. Notes faster motif. At the very, very end, it's a little bit of a tease trying to let the player know, hey, we're getting close to the center of the forest. We're about to have that motif at its full compressed form, but not yet. First, I wanted to add a little bit more of that compressed motif, not in the main melodic concept that you're hearing from the primary instruments, but rather as a little bit of an echo figure. So here, with the red arrows, we can see all of these motifs as they enter in different compression lengths. Continue that tease that I was talking about before. And this tease, again, is trying to get the player to think, oh, I am very close to the center of the forest, which is also where their first core task is completed, helping the NPC Luciana reach her home. And we finally reach the center of the forest. The center of the forest, we're going to use pretty much the same harmonic development that we had before at the beginning, except for now we have that raised to 7th scale grade. We see a sharp at the beginning, so that's a little bit more standard to our major sound. Here we see we have a slow variation. We can consider this an expanded motif. Here we have a slow and inverted variation. Instead of going down, B down, it's a small step up, B up. Works very well as an accompaniment pattern, so that it's not something the players get hit over the head with, but rather, if they listen closely enough, they can start to hear how all bits of music are tied into this motivic formula. Now, as we get a little bit further into the game, we enter the dark part of the forest. Now, this is when the lighting in the game starts to change. I wanted to make sure that the players were hearing something that was quite different from the emotional context that we had provided before. So far, everything has been relatively explorative and playful. But here, we're starting to get a little bit more eerie and ominous. One way that I wanted to incorporate this was with slowing down the tempo as we go through these little 8-bar figures. Now, a problem that I ran into was that it's very difficult for us to keep combat and non-combat together when one of them is slowing down in tempo and the other one is supposed to be remaining consistent. So this is one of those instances where I had to decide, do I want to try and accommodate by adjusting the non-combat into just on the grid with the tempo all the way through, or do I want to try and make the combat music fit this tempo grid, slowing down? The other option is to separate combat and non-combat so that we go from combat into non-combat and non-combat into combat as two separate pieces of music that can just happen to move from one to another at any time. This is the standard way that you would see this type of combat system working in a Diablo-style ARPG like Dreams and Nightmares. So I like to use that just for the third area of this act. And that was specifically because I was told at the beginning of it we would not have very many enemies at all, and they would be all packed together in the second half of this area. So using that, I decided this is probably going to be a good time to use this slowing down technique. Here you can see the motif playing the solo violin much slower than it does in the flute, as you can assume. And this will repeat to keep that eerie feeling until we start to get into our first combat in this area. At which point, we We will still hear that solo violin playing the motif in an expanded form, but it's going to feel a little bit faster because now we don't have the tempo slowing down. Likewise, we will continue to have the flute, clarinet, and now even the brass coming with a faster version of this motif. And finally, we get to boss battle of Act 1. Gala, the Peacock King, the King of Pride. Now, I wanted to make this a bit different than the music that we've heard so far. However, I still wanted to incorporate the motif as the core element through which the music was written. So I decided to incorporate an odd meter. Meter has to do with how many beats per measure we are hearing in different iterations of when a strong beat comes in. Here we could hear this as a loose 4 beats per measure, but when I wrote it, I split each of these 4 beats into groups of 7. So, if you ever want to try and play a fast odd meter in 7, we can go ahead and test this right now. I would like you guys to try this.
So we're gonna tap left and right, all right? All right, now we're gonna try keeping that, but going with our emphasis, left, 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 right, 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 left, 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 right, 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 left, 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 right, 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 left, 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 right, right, right.
Close enough. All right, so you can hear this as a grouping of 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Partway through the battle, I wanted to throw the listener off and incorporate a little bit more of the electric guitar. So what I did for those sections in the bridge was switch it to a different grouping of 7. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2. And so we can hear that here. I also tried to use an octatonic scale in order to incorporate more distance to the harmonic development. Most of the scales that we know are heptatonic, which means that there are only 7 notes in that scale. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, and then we're back to do as a new octave. Here, with the octatonic scale, we are alternating between half steps and whole steps, all the way until we get back to our original note, the G that we started on. I also decided to chain parts of the motif together in the main iteration of the melody. So we will hear the solo violin take over the main melody, and you'll hear parts of this 7-note motif change to the 7-note motif afterwards. And here we change. Notice that I'm taking the 3rd and 4th note from the motif and putting it in different areas as we come out of those chain motifs. So that it doesn't sound like we're hearing the motif too often, but we are hearing a part of it. Next, we have the main fat roll. This was developed by Musty Creative LLC. And so the fat roll melody here is a little bit simpler. We just have 3 notes going stepwise upward, and then a small skip down, or a small leap down, we can consider it. And so here we can see the motif, and also the tail motif, a secondary motif that we see in the second part. Da, 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 that descending motion. We will see the primary motif circled in red, and we will see the secondary motif, the tail motif, circled in orange. This is meant to be playful music for the main theme. There's also the world band, which overworld where you go from one level to another level. And I decided I wanted to keep this motif present in that, but I definitely wanted to change the emotional quality. So what I want you to do is try to look at what we saw from the main level music and try to see if you can hear where the motif comes in any form. It could be inverted, it could be expanded, it could be compressed. Try to see if you can hear any of them throughout this whole map music, which is much more peaceful. Anyone hear some motifs thrown in there? Wonderful. Next, we have our cutscene 3. I've only incorporated the sheet music for the very beginning of it, but I wanted to show you how the motifs are chained together so that it continues to have this upward motion. However, we are sending it from one instrument group to another, so that it doesn't sound like it's just a scale going upward, but rather the truncated version of this motif. 3 notes, bum, bum, bum. And we hear that from different instrument groups, so that our ear can separate them. Now here's where the character was expecting to get to the end of the game, but unfortunately fell down into the back levels. And we hear our original theme. You hear these strings. They're like this. That's supposed to represent the waves from the back, which is obviously a cat's worst enemy. And finally, for that one, we have the bridge of the final level. So every one of the main levels has a bridge section to it. I decided to incorporate the bridge of the final level to show you guys because it has the most instruments incorporated into it. As you go through the levels, more instruments are added in, and this is its final form. Again, I would like you to look at the motif that we have present at the top and try to see if you can hear it in its different forms during this bridge. Did you catch them? So yes? A few yeses at least. Next we have our third game, Breaker's World. Breaker's World is being developed in partnership with Wholesale University and Zagabah Studios and Delphi Studios, set to release public alpha in September, I do believe. So the basic premise of this game is that you are on a planet and you are trying to build up your ship in order to get off of the planet. In order to do so, you need to upgrade your ship, upgrade your suit, and recruit crew members in order to pilot your ship. So here's the main player ship theme. Right? This is where I want to incorporate the core entity of the motif, so that it's the strongest for the listener. Mainly because I would expect that a large portion of the time will be spent in the player ship as they are upgrading their ship and talking to different crew members that they have recruited. So here, we have a primary motif of a short note leading up to a long note. We also have a tail motif, or secondary motif, which is stepwise downward fashion. Now, this is normally presented with a long note followed by 2 shorter notes. However, throughout this piece, there are some instances where all these notes are the same length, or especially the first 2 notes are the same length. This is still going to be heard by the listener as part of the tale, because we are incorporating an element called rubato. Has anyone heard the term rubato before? Yeah? So rubato, for those that do not know, is when you are taking your tempo, the speed of your beat, and slightly making it faster or slower to give an emotive quality to the piece. So, in order to do that, I have given a little bit more emotion to certain areas of this piece by holding off like you would if you were conducting a full orchestra. So here we can see 3 instances of the primary motif, followed by 1 instance of the tempo. Now here we have an inverted primary motif, a lead downward rather than a lead upward. Now a faster tail moving into the primary motif, chains together. Here this note is being used as both the end of a primary motif and the beginning of a rhythmically inverted primary motif. Here we have an interpolated form of the tail with 1 added note, 4 notes descending the step. And finally, a long, simple, standard tail motif at the end. Now, I wanted this motif to come back into different areas of the game because this is meant to represent the breaker class, which is the low socioeconomic class of this planet. They are people who go to the broken down ships and try to break them down for their core parts so they can sell them and try to sustain themselves on this barren, Tatooine-like planet. That's a Star Wars planet, for those of you. So you hear the breaker motif coming back in the hulks, which are the abandoned ships that you explore throughout the planet in order to try and gain cores to upgrade either your ship or your suit, as well as possibly run into enemies that you could potentially recruit. So I wanted to hear this motif, but I wanted it to be a little bit less active and a little bit more distant. In the hulks, you really only hear it coming through from the primary trumpet line, like you heard it in the player ship, if you had upgraded your suit with what's called a command core. I wanted that to be the main thing that was representing your character, who is a breaker. Later in the hulks, we can hear this come back again in a little bit of an extended form. Now you'll see that we have 3 of the primary motifs together, just like the player should be, which normally the player should be was followed by a tail. So the listener, after hearing these 3 motifs, is expecting the tail to come afterwards with a stepwise up motion. As circled in orange. However, is this a full tail? Anyone? No, it's just 1 note. So we're left with a little bit of unresolution, not hearing the final tail, not even really hearing it as a tail, but still expecting it based on what we've heard from the playership. Likewise, I wanted to throw the breaker motif into the outpost, which is the town where you go to recruit new members and trade for things. You'll notice that this is both a tail and it could be interpreted as an interpolated tail motif. This time with 5 notes instead of 4. Now you hear that we have two leaps in succession here. What's happening is we have a long note leading up to a short note. Now, is that the motif, or is that a rhythmically inverted motif? Anyone? 1 and 2. Show it. 2, exactly, yeah. We have a long note that is leading up to a shorter note. So, it is going to be heard as rhythmically inverted. However, that's going to leave up right away again. So now we have a short note leading up to a long note. Is that going to be our primary motif, or is that going to be our rhythmically inverted motif? 1 that time, yes, exactly. Right? So now we are chaining together a rhythmically inverted motif with the primary motif itself. Of course, after we hear those leaps in succession, we're expecting a tail, and we get the first 2 notes of it, leaving it still slightly unresolved. Later in the breaker, in the outpost, we hear this coming even more often in its original form, 3 motifs followed by the tail, just like in the player ship. Chaining together, just like the player ship, into another of 3 primary motifs. We have an inverted primary motif, just like the player ship. This time, we incorporate the inverted primary motif a few more times. Here we hear 3 primary motifs and expect the tail, but don't get it. Instead, we get the 3 primary motifs repeated in a third pitch level. This time, it is followed by the tail. This we can interpret as 2 tails chained together, or again, we can consider it an interpolated tail, 5 notes in succession. And again, I wanted this to represent the breaker class, so this is something that is representative of both the class as well as your character, who is a member of that class, trying to save the rest of the breakers from this planet. So, thank you for listening to my talk on this.